lots of stuff going on in sports this past weekend. I just mentioned Dave and I were talking about that off air. But one of the more interesting stories has to do with Albert Pujols. And Albert Pujols is now threatening legal action against Jack Clark for comments that Jack Clark said pertaining to the fact that Albert Pujols was doing PEDs. And this information came through a third source, and yet no sooner had Jack Clark said this than he was fired from his radio job along with his partner. So, the laws of when you defame somebody or allegedly defame somebody are different, I know, in Canada and the U.S. Can you explain to me now, Dave, what happens now? Albert Pujols decides he wants to engage in legal action. Is the onus on him to prove it, or is the onus on the person who was allegedly defamed him for him to prove it?
Well, the steps are basically that Albert Pujols needs to show that something was communicated, which it obviously was. It was communicated to someone other than Albert Pujols. So you can't defame somebody by accusing them directly of something. So the first step is the communication to a third party. That'll be simple enough. Then the fact that it's false. And that is a bit of a debate, but I would suspect Pujols would very clearly point to no failure of a drug test and nothing but hearsay as far as an alleged statement from 12 years ago. I think one of the bigger hurdles will be for a public figure, so for a celebrity like Albert Pujols, you not only need to show that it was a false communication that actually harmed Albert Pujols, but you also need to show that there was actual malice. And that means that there was either an intent to cause harm or reckless disregard for the truth or lack of truth of the statement. And I think that's a bit of a tougher hurdle, and it's meant to be that way. Celebrities and public officials are meant to have a higher threshold because they are going to be spoken about and communicated about so frequently.
So what happens now in the case of Jack Clark? What legal rights does he have if he wants to turn around and sue the radio station that he works for, saying essentially he was just doing his job?
Well, that depends on the terms of his employment contract a great deal. If they have a lot of discretion for getting rid of an employee for causing them harm or causing the name of their station to be brought into disrepute, then they would claim that this is an open and shut case. But it really depends on the specific terms of his employment contract. It has been rumored that both he and his co-host would be looking to sue the station as well, specifically the co-host who didn't make the statement. He, if anything, just stated his opinion, as opposed to, I think, the critical wording from Jack Clark is, I know for a fact, as opposed to, I was told blank, by this third party. He said, I know for a fact, that he's a user or a juicer or whatever term that he used. I think that will cause Jack Clark a bit more problems.
And now we're talking about the information that allegedly came from the trainer.
That's right.
So what kind of legal rights does he have?
Well, he could theoretically have the same rights to defamation and arguably a lower threshold to meet than Albert Pujols if he can show, that he's harmed by these comments and that, again, they were false. Interestingly, I'm not sure how they would fight over whether or not statements were made 12 or 13 years ago. It would appear to be a pure he said debate. So it would be interesting to see how courts deal with it if it ever did get that far. My suspicion is that it wouldn't.
Yeah, and let's say, for example, that it did get that far. Would we basically, how do you prove it? Do you do a polygraph test, or is it basically you put him on the witness stand and he basically says, you're under oath right now, and he says, I deny the claims or whatever? How do you elicit the information or the alleged information that was passed, again, from one party to the next, so that the person who allegedly said it can either say that it's false or it's, obviously he's not going to say it's true, but how do you elicit the information to prove that he did in fact say it?
Well, I suspect it would be, and I'm not a Missouri lawyer nor a Missouri litigator, of course, but I suspect it would be an exchange of sworn statements. So basically what you've said, I don't think it would go to a polygraph, but, a sworn affidavit from each party of what they claim the facts to be, and then a judge essentially weighing the evidence. So the onus is on the plaintiff to show that they've been defamed, but the onus is also on the purported maker of the statement to show that it was true. So if there's nothing but, Jack Clark says the statement was made, and the trainer says that it wasn't, it would be tough to see that threshold being met.
Now, what I find interesting is Albert Pujols claiming it's not true. He's been tested umpteen times, and he's never tested positive. I think of Jose Bautista of the Toronto Blue Jays, and when he started to hit all those home runs, there was kind of like allegations that maybe he was maybe he was juicing, and then he came forward and said basically, this was a few months later that they're testing me all these times, right? It's not fair. I'm being tested so much. If the evidence isn't there, then how can you basically approach it and saying, how could Albert Pujols be accused of doing something when there's no evidence with all these tests? And having said that, we've just gone through a slew of these things there with all these players who've been suspended, some for a great deal of time, and I don't think they ever tested positive. If they did...
No, they didn't. None of the biogenesis players tested positive, except the three, like Melky Cabrera, that did test positive and already received their punishment. But none of the other players tested positive, and I think that would go to Pujols' claim of intent to cause harm or reckless disregard. He would say, it's patently obvious to anyone that pays attention to this that he's never failed to test, and that he hasn't been, nor has he been tied to biogenesis or anything else. So that would be part of his evidence that Jack Clark did defame him, notwithstanding that it's a higher threshold for a celebrity. He'd say, A, you have a greater responsibility because you're a journalist as a radio host than just a regular fan, but B, you've got no basis. So to make that statement, you're knowingly making a inflammatory, defamatory statement, and that would be part of Albert Pujols' claim.
The other thing I find interesting, if you're talking about these athletes who haven't tested positive, and yet we got all this stuff with the biogenesis, it just makes me wonder if somehow or another there is some sort of way that these athletes are doing it, and it's being camouflaged by some other way.
Well, that's the problem with drug testing generally, is that, purely financially, there's just more money in making drugs that avoid the testing than there is in making tests that catch all the drugs. So, there's more incentive to cheat, and unfortunately the drug makers remain ahead of the drug testers, which is why I think biogenesis is so notable, is that baseball was successfully able to punish 13 players, including Ryan Braun, and 14 if their Alex Rodriguez punishment holds up, based purely on non-analytic positives. Because to me, and to baseball and to other sports that are moving that way, non-analytic positives are their best and only real chance of standing toe-to-toe with the drug makers, because they just can't get the testing up to speed. So it's going to take some other way, and that other way in biogenesis' case was volumes, reportedly volumes of evidence and text messages and receipts and all those other things.